Hi, I'm going to be discussing how my real life identity compares and contrasts my identity virtually. So, your virtual identity can largely differ from the way you present yourself in real life, depending on what type of medium and what type of culture you're in within a certain circumstance. My identity online or virtually really doesn't differ from my real life personality too much because I tend to not use any technology that isn't transparent. So by that I mean typically everything I use is going to be attached to my real life identity in some way, whether it be my real name, a picture, or just some type of key identifier. And I think in that situation, people tend to be a little bit more in tune with how they would typically act in a regular social situation. But there's certain technologies that are a little bit less transparent, and those are the ones where you tend to see a bit more of a contrast. Now, the virtual identity really allows you to take on many different roles and act in ways that you typically wouldn't act in real life. And the more that the identity or the setting virtually is less linked to your real life identity, the more you're going to really differ and really tend to explore and accentuate some of these other facets of your personality. And one thing I think is really fascinating, there tends to be almost like a mob mentality when people are somewhat anonymous online. And it's almost similar to in the real life situation of in a riot, where people may participate and do things that they would never do on their own, but they tend to feel almost like a faceless member of the crowd or a member of the mob, and it really alters their actions. So online, we see that same type of situation. The technology that you're using itself is obviously going to influence your actions. Like I said, whether it is closely linked to your real life identity is going to be a big part of that. And another part of that, I think, is just the environment or the culture that you're involved in any given circumstance as well. For example, if you're on a gaming site and you're beating someone, you may be more inclined to trash talk. Whereas in real life, if you were playing a board game face to face and you were winning, you may tend to be a little bit more humble. For example, the classroom discussion board, there's a certain level of decorum, and you wouldn't really see that same type of attitude in, say, an anonymous message board where you're not using your real name. The identity that you would get in an anonymous site can kind of mask who you are. You can mask your gender. It can mask your ethnicity, or it can mask who you are in real life. And even in those situations or those websites where the technology doesn't lend itself to that transparency, there can still be some dead giveaways. I've been on message boards that are fairly anonymous. There's no indicator of location. But when I see someone say something like, hey, I'm going to the lab, or it's the end of the summer, I'm going away to uni instead of going away to college, dead giveaway that that person is most likely British. So there are those key indicators. And then you see on news sites, for example, people arguing back and forth, whether it's anonymous or they're using the real name. And that's just something that's influenced by the environment or by the medium itself, regardless of how linked your identity is within that certain circumstance. Another example is something a website like Reddit is really anonymous. It's just simply a username. It's really easy to create a username and switch identities constantly. So people do things that they would never do in real life and say things that they would never say just because of that anonymity. And it is almost like a performance. People will be in a certain situation, kind of reference back to what I said earlier with the gaming site. You may be on a winning streak and you take on the persona of the champion and you're trash talking people and you're just acting in a way that you never would have. And it just lends itself to you acting in a way that you never really would. And it just allows you to kind of take on that role and do that role playing, which is really fascinating. So, Obviously, a lot of these things, just like I said there with Reddit, you're doing things that you would never do in public. You're behaving in a way that you would never if you were face to face. And I think a lot of that has to do with social norms. They're just kind of developing online. Whereas in real life, someone had a disagreement, you overheard someone on the street, you would just probably keep your mouth shut. Whereas, yeah, on like a news website commenting on usatoday.com, someone disagrees with you, You could say, hey, you're an idiot, that's rude. And within that setting, it's somewhat acceptable. Whereas in real life, it is a completely different situation, and just you're going to be looked at by people in public. You're going to almost embarrass yourself in a way. You wouldn't get embarrassed saying some of these things online, and you would get embarrassed if you were saying these things face to face, where you might bump into these people again. So I think your digital identity is almost kind of not completely separate. You're going to act in a way, like I said, accentuating certain behaviors. So it's not fully separate. It's something that you have within yourself. You obviously have the ability to act out and play these different roles. So it's not really two separate identities. It's always something that you have inside yourself. It's just a matter of the context, of the culture where you're at, and especially that transparency, whether people know who you are and can link you to your real life persona. So I think as this starts to develop and become more prevalent, we're going to see maybe more social norms develop online. But it's really fascinating just these last 10, 20 years to see people develop this presence in a virtual situation.